Hey family, my name is Chris. I am your home gamer dad. Viewer discretion advised while watching this video today, for we will be diving into the lore of the killers from Final Girl. Final Girl is a solo survival horror game published by Ryder Games, where you are the titular Final Girl going up against one of these maniacs, psychos, demons, ghosts. Will the Final Girl defeat the menace that is terrorizing them and their friends? Or will they become just another victim? We won't know that today, because instead of playing, we're going to dive into backstories using the lore book right here to get a better idea on what makes these creatures tick. These will be direct readings from the book, with a few visuals in there if you wish to watch. But I advise turning the lights down, the volume up, and get ready to meet the monsters. Hans, the Butcher. The campers sat around the fire, pretending to listen to another one of Edwin's famous spooky stories. Some were giggling, others were checking their phones, but all of them were pissing the counselor off. "Listen up, you little piss ants." That got their attention. Clearly the stories haven't been scary enough, so we'll cut the kitty crap. He paused for effect, which more or less worked. "Have you ever heard of Hans?" "You mean the guy in the piggy mask? Big deal," one smart aleck threw back in his face. "It's called a German shame mask. Now listen up." For once, they did. Hans made everyone in the small town of Happy Trails uncomfortable. The boy never spoke, which was part of it. He would tag along with his parents and older siblings whenever they came to town to hawk their wares, standing in the back of the butcher stall, looking down on everyone. That was also a source of the unease, his freakish height. Although he was the youngest child in the Metzger clan, a family of butchers who had immigrated from Germany, he towered over all of them, even Helmut, the family's imposing patriarch. But his height and lack of speech weren't the real reasons why the town avoided him and the children ran in fear. It was the wooden pig mask that he wore.
"That's just my naughty little Liebchen, always too hungry for his own good,"
Ada, his mother, would say when asked about it. The townfolk came to understand that Hans was being punished for his gluttony, forced to display his shame for all to see. His appetite must be ravenous. He was never seen without the mask, although wet munching sounds could be heard from beneath it. Hans was tolerated because the meat the Metzgers sold out of their stall was better than anything else in town. Putting up with their giant mask-wearing freak was a small price to pay for pork chops and ribeyes of this quality. Over time, things changed. Fewer of the children came to market. They were tending the farm while we were gone. Ada began to waste away. A recent illness, that's all. And Helmut became sallow and hollow-eyed. Just a season of hard work, nothing more. Hans's presence remained unchanged, with the exception that his wooden mask was replaced by a brutal iron one. The residents of Happy Trails said nothing publicly. Privately, they began enjoying their steak dinners less and less. 1 month, the Metzgers simply didn't appear at market. No Helmut, no Ada, no Hans, and no prime rib. The town decided to send a small search party to the farm to check on the family. They found it deserted. The house was empty. No animals grazed in the pasture. An eerie quiet lay over the entire property, as if even the birds and insects had left. The last place they looked was the barn, an imposing red structure behind the main homestead that the Metzgers had used as their slaughterhouse. They opened the doors and went inside. Afterwards, the search party refused to talk about what they had seen. Instead, they burned the barn and the rest of the farm to the ground and walked back to Happy Trails with the look of soldiers returning from war. "The Metzgers are gone," is all they would say. The other butchers in town went out of business. The appetite for meat evaporated overnight. Animals began disappearing first. A goat here, a cow there, every so often a beloved family dog. The first child to go missing shocked Happy Trails, which had always been a safe community. But it was only after the fourth had disappeared that people began to leave. Thomas Huffsetter said he saw an enormous dark shape drag Mary Woodson into the dark. Others said they heard crunching sounds coming from the woods at night. Most believed them and fled. Some remained out of stubbornness. That year was a census year, but when the census taker arrived at Happy Trails, They found it utterly empty. Many of the doors were open with rotting meals on the table, as if the families living there simply disappeared mid-bite. Eventually, the town was razed and forgotten. Happy trails, population 0. Years later, this camp was built on top of where the town once was. Over there, Edwin pointed off into the dark, that's where the Metzger's farmhouse used to be. If you listen carefully, you can still hear Hans wandering through the trees, dragging his hammer and munching on something wet and chewy beneath his iron mask. As all the campers turned to look, they heard a wet, crunching sound in the trees. Right on cue, they screamed, with some even hightailing it away in the opposite direction. Edwin began to laugh. You little punks, we planned that. Zeke was hiding in the woods waiting to make his Hans sound until I finished the story. The last thing Edwin heard was a sickening crunch as his skull collapsed in a geyser of bone and scarlet. The immense figure behind him in an iron pig mask hoisted the giant hammer, now slick with blood, and surveyed the remaining campers, some fleeing into the woods, others frozen in fear. In the flickering firelight, it looked as if the mask was smiling. Hans couldn't help but admire the lovely buffet that had been delivered to his home, like pigs to the slaughter. The Poltergeist of Creech Manor. Creech Manor is a home that is over 100 years old. It has the kind of character and charm that people love. It is the kind of home where every step, every new room, can call to one's imagination a story from the past. The wise reader would stop reading now and keep whatever happy sunshine beaming through the majestic windows picture that they have in their head. For what follows will stick like a shadowy leech onto your soul forever. The happy image stories the average person would envision are a far cry from the real and actual horrible events that have taken place in the manor over the years. The below accounts are just a few of the many atrocities that have occurred in the home. 1912. The original owner, named Robert Creech, a wealthy commodities trader and statesman, was found hanged in the attic by his much younger wife, Helen. She inherited the wealth and was able to do a great deal of good with it, but eventually the money ran out. She went up to the attic one night and ingested a concoction of champagne and a large amount of rat poison, unaware of how slow and painful the process of her death would be. During the investigation, the neighbors that lived a half a mile away said that they heard a horrific wailing coming from the direction of the manor that lasted most of the night. 1957. Tim Grace was a boy of 13 when he came back home from the circus with a brand new clown doll. He was on top of the world. At night, he'd keep the clown sitting up on the chair across the room. He felt safe with it watching over him. One night, a fierce lightning storm came through the area. Tim was staring at the clown, and each time the lightning flashed in the darkness, the clown's expression seemed to change. When its eyes went red, he was sure of it and threw his blankets over the clown and the chair. The next day when he woke up, the clown and the blanket were both gone. Tim was relieved but confused. For the next 11 days, Tim pleaded with his parents to move, claiming, "The clown doll attacks me every night." But when they observed him at night, it seemed to just be night terrors and bad dreams. They saw no doll. They would finally be convinced to move by the suffocation death of their son just a few days later. He was found with a blanket wrapped so tightly around his head, you could see the shape of his screaming face in the blanket. 1981. Lucy loved staring out the window at the old oak. She wondered if it was older than the manor itself. It was obviously the oldest tree in the neighborhood. She smiled as the wind bristled its leaves. Such a beautiful tree. As the days went by, she spent more and more time at the window. When her husband came home from work one day and found her in the exact same spot as when he left that morning, he became concerned. He tried to get her help, and Lucy resented him from that moment forward. How dare he take her away from the tree? When they returned that night, they shared no words and went to bed under an awkward silence. Lucy woke up in the early hours of the night and went to the window. The tree, who had been speaking to her for some time now, offered to protect her. It reached out its largest branch toward the window and opened what can only be described as a hand-shaped branch in front of her. She opened the third-floor window and climbed out onto the sill. She hesitated, but then looked up at the tree itself. Smiling, she stepped forward and plummeted to her death. Geppetto, the Puppet Master. The cacophony of screams pierced the air set against a sharp display of bright lights and gaudy attractions, just distracting enough to mask their derelict state. A man of gangly and odd proportions stood behind the big top, his arms hanging at his side with his head cocked to the side just far enough to be unsettling in its natural state. His ringmaster uniform belied his true purpose, but served well enough to present himself as the father of this operation. The man sat impossibly still, so still one might be forgiven for thinking he was a mannequin, if not for the ferocious pace of his fingers flicking back and forth. Running the show was no small feat after all. With all the lights and attractions, the movements were easy enough to miss all across the carnival. What was a shadow flitting to the corner of a tent amidst the spinning lights of the big top? Who would even think to look under the clown car before getting in, much less notice the wires going taut and creaking wood amidst the terrors of the haunted forest? Even the screams and caterwauling of improperly educated children were easily covered by the roar of the tiger. The man was a conductor in a way, and this was his orchestra, a grand performance put on wherever his family carnival found themselves. He couldn't possibly do it without the diligent aid of his doting children, of course. So many children were ungrateful these days, like the group that found themselves here tonight. Not like his family. His family was perfect. His children were statuesque in their beauty, flawless, and unmarred by the passage of time, perfectly obedient and diligent in their devotion to their father. He had made the perfect home. Sometimes he wished they were more motivated on their own and took the first steps to show him their love on their own accord. But it was surely better this way. It took many dedicated hands to keep the tents in good repair, to break down and set up their traveling operations. It wasn't easy work, or work for the faint of heart, and the children could be whimsical if left to their own devices. The children that wandered into his carnival this night were unremarkable, as all of the imperfect children were, but none so unremarkable that they couldn't be fixed. He was a master of his craft after all. Fixing broken toys was a skill that came second nature to any good father. They ran amok through the carnival, drinking to excess, wandering off together for lewd pleasures, throwing their refuse around the grounds just because it seemed like they would not be caught. Horrid little creatures, as flawed as they were. All except one. One girl among them stood out. She carried herself in a way that showed confidence as she strode around the ground. She did her best to keep the others in line and chide them for potentially getting them kicked out. The old man was thoroughly amused that she thought they'd leave. She was the only one who was wise to the ruse, though. She and the rest of the group looked for some of their missing friends, some of the most unseemly ones that couldn't be tolerated even for a moment more. Not that they'd find them, of course. Well, not until it was too late. She was even wise enough to try to get them to stick together instead of splitting up. Inconvenient, but not an impossible obstacle for an experienced professional. Slowly, his children encircled the group, coming from several sides as they made their way through the carnival. Wires grew more taut as they drew closer to the imperfect ones. He decided from the moment he laid eyes on them, he'd deal with the burly athletic one first. For some reason, they always put their confidence in athletic ones to protect them. But they bled like any other, and were often easier to overtake because of their lack of fear. He believed his children would delight in carving the oaf, and the children always came first. 3 of his children clacked across the ground at an incredible clip. One leaped up onto the back of the giant jock and started with his throat, as the other 2 took to the man's legs like they were Jack's beanstalk. The group of the imperfect trespassers screamed in terror at the display, ill-prepared and stunned by the beauty and grace of the perfect creatures before them, no doubt. Most of them panicked and ran off every which way, any and all sensibility abandoned at the sight of their dead friend, but not before the beloved children felled another young woman. Her artistic skill clearly fell short of his own judging by the grisly visage across her painted face. He clearly replaced that part with another. The special one, the one he'd seen stand out, grabbed a nearby hammer and swung it with all her might, catching one of his children in the air with a sickening crunch as bone, flesh, and splintered wood crushed under the weight of the hammer. Fury filled the puppet master along with a particular glee. This one was special indeed, and Geppetto would have a new daughter before the night was over. Of this, he was sure. Inkanyamba, the Avenger. The man sat on the ridge and looked out over the West African valley in the pre-dawn light. He called himself Inkanyamba, but that wasn't the name he was born with. He no longer remembered who he had been, but that didn't trouble him. For now, he had purity. He had power. He had a singular, divinely appointed purpose.
I am the Holy Avenger.
The morning sun crested the rise and began to banish the shadows from the valley. First to come into relief were the holy groves, a beautiful marsh of black-blue water and hallowed wood. Inkanyamba's name was lost to him, but he remembered meditating there as a child, sitting at the feet of the great tree and soaking in the peace of the place. Next came the sacred shrine, an ancient construction of wood and bronze, built to honor the gods of old that Inkanyamba had given his entire being to. Finally, the burial grounds, where the prophets and saints who worshipped the old ones were buried, in both marked and unmarked graves. Inkanyamba would often walk between the tombstones and mausoleums in the dead of night, hoping to draw whatever wisdom he could from their holy bones.
I am the living wrath of the gods, their faithful servant of justice.
But as the sun brought light to the valley, it also brought them, the outsiders, the defilers, the apostates. They arrived on their noisy buses, bleaching toxic smog into the air. They had no respect for this sacred place. It was nothing but an amusement to them, an afternoon diversion where they could snap their pictures and desecrate the holy place with their obnoxious voices. And the gods were angry. Inkanyamba could feel their displeasure through his entire body. He unsheathed his curved knives and ran his tongue across the edge.
I will rid my sacred groves of the cancer. I will cut it out with blood and screaming, and the gods will be pleased with me.
Inkanyamba no longer remembered who he had been, but that didn't trouble him. For now, there was holy work to be done, and he was the one to do it. Dr. Fright, the Dream Doctor. Dr. Franklin Wright was a renowned dream therapist who, through the use of psychic abilities, was able to treat his patients by manipulating their dream, a substantial power to be sure. He began experimenting without his patients' knowledge, and instead of happy, soul-fulfilling dreams, he began manipulating their dreams to be dark, terrifying experiences. He was convinced that by having patients overcome their fears in a dream state, that they would learn to overcome their problems in the real world. It worked for many of his patients, and he was extremely happy with the result. But a few weeks into these frightmares, as he called them, a teenage patient of his named Lisa Smalley leapt from the roof of her high school. It happened just hours after a session with Dr. Wright at her home on Maple Lane, and she died immediately on impact. Lisa's parents were furious and fully blamed Dr. Wright, or Dr. Fright as he was becoming known. He lost most of his other patients after the terrible tragedy, And soon, he had none at all. His business collapsed, and he nearly went broke. He began toting his frightmare therapy online and quickly developed a cult following. Most of the people watched to make fun of him, but a few were willing to try it out. It was then that Frankie learned that he could enter his subjects' dreams from anywhere. And not only that, he learned that trauma within the dreams was leaving real-life wounds. When one of his chief critics, some 20-something YouTuber named Scully, agreed to frightmare therapy as a joke for his fan base, Dr. Fright decided to push the limits. No one knows what happened inside the dream, but a shocked audience witnessed Scully's wrist open up on a live stream. Despite quick reactions by his fans to call 911, Scully was dead before the ambulance arrived at the bloody scene. Meanwhile, Lisa's parents, Mike and Rhonda, had been planning Franklin Wright's demise for weeks from their home on Maple Lane. When they saw the news of a manhunt for Wright, they knew they had to act quickly before he was caught and sent to prison for life. They felt prison would not be enough to stop his power, and that only in death would his evil be stopped. They knew exactly where to find Franklin. For the past few weeks, they'd been paying a private eye to follow him, so they knew about his secret office in the boiler room of an abandoned factory in town. Rhonda's father owned a farm 40 miles outside the town, and after they used pepper spray to subdue him, they put a bag over his head and drove him there. They unloaded the man from the trunk and dragged him inside the barn. They were so eager for revenge. When Mike pulled his gun out and pointed it at Wright's head, Rhonda put her hand on his wrist, slowly lowering his arm.
Wait, that's too good for him. He needs to suffer, to feel pain, like the pain we felt since losing Lisa.
She nodded over to a pitchfork in the corner of the barn. Mike nodded in agreement. As he lay on the hay-covered barn floor, Franklin looked up as the bag was removed from his head to find Rhonda raising the pitchfork. Franklin tried to move, but with his hands bound behind his back and Mike holding him down, he was unable to avoid the violent stabs as Rhonda brought the pitchfork down again and again and again. Franklin lived through his eyes being gouged out, his lungs and neck being punctured, and even a stab that clipped the heart. But finally, he felt his life slipping away. The stabs continued, and there was blood everywhere, but the pain was gone. And then, just before his last breath escaped his lips, it hit him.
Go into the dream world.
No one heard from Dr. Franklin Wright again, not for many years, until a high school senior who lived with her adopted parents on Maple Lane had a strange dream that she was in a boiler room. There was a man there in the shadows. He didn't respond to her calls of "Hello, who's there?" He moved towards her, scraping something metal on the pipes that ran along the walls beside him. It looked kind of like a claw. As he came closer and moved into the musky light, she noticed that what he held was actually the head of a pitchfork, broken at the handle. The prongs had been bent at the tips, and it certainly did not look like it was for farming. As he came out of the shadows, the girl's eyes went wide. The man was wearing a bloody sweater vest and was grotesquely disfigured with pockmark-like scars all over his face and neck. Little dimple-like scars everywhere. Sheila Smalley turned and ran. Dr. Fright lives on in the dream world to terrify and exact his evil revenge on the Smalleys and all the other residents of Maple Lane. Thank you all for joining me as we learn a little bit more about the monsters and maniacs that terrorize us in the game of Final Girl. You will see playthroughs of this on my channel in the future. For that, I won't do a full how to play, but I will explain what makes each location and each killer unique as I go through them. Which killer would you be most afraid of? Which one would you not want to bump into in the middle of the night? Who do you think you could beat? Who could you outrun? The answer is the person in front of you. Let me know if you enjoyed this type of video and you want to see more. I have plenty of other things that I can read the lore from and have a good time with it. But until then, take care of yourselves and each other. We are family forever, gaming together, hiding under the covers in the dark as we hear the door slowly creek open. You guys stay safe. I'll see you in the next one.